Hi all, it's Chris Leach here from Decisive War Game Design, and today I wanted to do a quick leaf through of Maximilian, Control the Catastrophe Maximilian, the latest rule set. This, as I say, is just going to be a very brief leaf through. I'm not going to go exhaustively into all the rules, but it will be actually a quick overview. So let's have a look at what you get in the printed version. Of course, the PDF is exactly the same, but here we have the, as I say, the glossy printed version, glossy cover that comes from Wargame Vault. So the format is very similar to Control the Catastrophe Caesar, if you already have that rule set. And in fact, the core mechanics derive obviously from that set. So they're kind of a family of rules. The usual forward and acknowledgements. As I mentioned in my previous video for Control the Catastrophe Caesar, these books don't just happen. It takes literally years of work and play testing, and it really does rely upon, frankly, the support of friends around the world, actually, who've helped obviously develop the game and proofread. It's a horrible process, actually, the proofreading, and I got to give credit to those who helped me out with the editing. Table of contents, table of diagrams. I approach the organization of the book, of course, with section numbers. I find cross-referencing and indexing easier with these kinds of numbers as opposed to relying just on page numbers. Again, usual story, introduction, establishing some of the basics of the game overview, and of course, then moving on into the way that units are represented in the game. This game is a gridded game, and you can see that in the background here, although the grid is quite subtle using this mat from Deep Cut Studios. The gridded approach I know is a polarizing one. Some people have be in their bonnet about gridded games, and I have to admit, I was one of them. Until, as sort of an intellectual exercise, I decided, I really want to give this gridded approach to gaming a go. So that's actually how the whole Control the Catastrophe family of rules came about a good number of years ago. And I realized the many advantages of grids. There are some disadvantages. I will be, first to admit that. Of course, everything is always on a 90-degree in terms of how you move. But I find for any of the periods of linear warfare, which frankly dominates warfare for much of sort of organized human existence, it works really, really well. It kind of forces a kind of a linear quality to the aesthetic of the game. It's also, of course, massively beneficial from the standpoint of moving and measuring ranges. There's none of this business of the vagaries of using a ruler. So it speeds play, there's no disputes and all of that. Now, the most important thing, and I think it really stands out in this particular game, in the period covered by Maximilian, is that gridded games are incredibly scalable. In other words, whatever collection of figures you have, or however you imagine units to look like, you can go ahead, model your units, again, however you want, whether it's a pike block or cavalry units, whatever it happens to be, and then just apply an appropriate gridded surface, a grid box, to suit your units. If you're using small scale miniatures or large scale miniatures, if you're using lots of miniatures or very few. We literally have played games where a pike block might be this sort of middling size, or we've used a small gridded surface on a 6x4 table. In fact, it was actually a smaller table than that. And to playtest some of the scenarios and games, we literally used single stand units, so 9 figures. And regardless of what it is that you're, however you're organizing your models, they represent the same thing and behave the same way. And so, as I say, I think from the standpoint of scalability, the gridded playing surface is great. Anyway, I've gone on too long. This is supposed to be a leaf through, but it's important to know that about gridded games, that there are some distinct advantages to using the grid. So the rules go through, of course, the army representation, and specifically, how to deal with representing the different kinds of units in the game. And of course, the unit types are as you'd expect, heavy foot, heavy horse. There's obviously various kinds of light units as well. And the basic rules kind of leaves it at that. What's important is that the core rules, again, sharing most of the mechanics with Control the Catastrophe Caesar, I wanted to keep that fairly generic and as brief as possible. So as you're reading through the core rules, you won't necessarily see much specific information about, pike blocks and pike and shot units and all of that. That's left to the special rules section at the tail end. So you can learn the core rules and then get into bolting on what you need to know for your particular units for the period that you're covering. Again, this rule set covers basically the period from the Italian Wars through to the end of the 30 Years' War, and there will be a supplement for late 17th century, a free supplement that I'll put out to cover that transition period where pikes are still present. Once we've figured out sort of, the basic structure of units and their characteristics, we go on to the command and control aspect, the role of the commander and brigadiers in the game. Then, how do you deploy your army? A brief section here, but an important one. And there's a couple of options regarding how you deploy your army before play. Then we get into, obviously, how to play the game itself once you've deployed your armies. And I should point out, there are photographs, mostly of my own collection of figures, but I hope that most of them, this is probably not a good example of this, this is basically just eye candy, but most of the pictures in the rule set are illustrative of a game mechanic or a structure in the game. So there is some eye candy to be sure, but mostly I think the pictures are useful to model things. Sequence of play, the basic game assumes that, like in my own group, you're playing with multiple players. 4, 6, sometimes we'll get 10 guys playing the game. And so the basic turn sequence is an I go, you go approach. In the optional rules section, there is an alternative turn sequence that I think is actually more fun, a little more random, a little crazier, and that is suitable for when you're playing maybe with 1-on-1 or 2-on-2, where it's not just a full I go, you go system. So I know some people don't like I go, you go, but for large games, especially games where perhaps you're learning the rules, it's definitely a more efficient way of going. It just structures the game in such a way that it's easier to learn and organize. At conventions, I always use the I go, you go approach. The active side is the one that will rally off on form markers first, then perform movement and shooting. Then you go into the melee phase. What's an important aspect of the game is that you really do control the order in which you do things, in so much that, for example, in the movement phase, you decide what order you're going to move your units, but this might have implications in terms of the effects that those decisions have on other units, for example. Similarly, and most importantly perhaps, in the melee phase, you choose, if you're the active side, the order in which melees are resolved. So sometimes it of course makes sense to choose a flank charge first. And things happen very immediately, so you resolve for example, a particular combat between two units immediately, including all the subsequent effects of that melee, like pursuit, for example, or the effects of a unit having been broken. All that is done immediately. So there's not much sort of game memory that's required. You do things and you move on. Movement, obviously the grid facilitates movement. A basic principle in the game is that moving forward is easy. So if you move forward, you get a certain number of actions per unit type. So heavy infantry have 1 action, heavy cavalry and skirmishers, foot skirmishers have 2 actions, and light cavalry have 3 actions. That's pretty much it, by the way. And if you're moving forward, you just go ahead and you can move your 1 box or 2 boxes or 3 boxes. But if you complicate movement by, for example, moving obliquely, diagonally, or turning in place, your unit will automatically become unformed unless you surrender one of your move actions. Now, you probably already guessed that heavy infantry don't have extra move actions to surrender. So if you do something funky with heavy infantry as they're shuffling along, like move again diagonally or turning in place, they become unformed, and unformed can have fairly significant implications in combat. So you want to be careful about doing anything interesting in face of the enemy. If you know that the enemy's not going to jump on you, and of course the gridded surface means that pre-measuring is kind of a built-in reality, then by all means, do whatever you want and become unformed, because at the top of your next turn, you're going to remove that unformed marker. So the movement rules are very simple, again streamlined because of the gridded surface. There's obviously some prohibitions, usually regarding the placement of other units and obstacles, but by and large, most of the movement rules are fairly straightforward. A really important thing, though, is here in section 6.7, momentum. And here I just want to speak a little bit to that because I think it's important to the game and its design, and a little bit different. A lot of games have activation rules for brigades, and your army is divided into, heavy brigades particularly. I don't think that initiating movement was usually an issue. I think, if anything, what's historically more difficult is stopping movement once it's initiated. And this is the concept of momentum in the game. So heavy units that move beyond their deployment zone and are approaching enemy to their front, they have to keep moving to close with the enemy. Now, shooters have some exceptions, of course. They can stop to shoot. If no enemy is presented in front, again, you're not under momentum because you're clearly needing to maneuver to get an enemy to your front. There's a number of exceptions moving into terrain that you want to defend. Again, you can stop your movement. But if it's just simply an open field engagement and you have enemy to your front, and let's say you're a pike block, you will have to keep rolling forward unless you successfully roll a control test. So it's not particularly onerous. There's ways out of momentum, to be sure. It's still a game. But I think that is something that is an important element to the game, a little different than, as I say, so many other games where there's activation rules, but once you start moving, you can stop at will. I just don't think that's accurate. And if you want a sort of a primary source example of that, well, this is an ancient reference, for example. Julius Caesar, in his description of the Battle of Pharsalus, makes particular note that his legions were able to stop in front of Pompey's army. And here we have a Roman army, profoundly disciplined and trained. Caesar makes note of the fact that they were able to stop to reform ranks and all of that stuff. So again, momentum. Let me keep rolling here. I'm probably going longer than I should. There's evade rules. The move, counter move, or Igo-Yugo system kind of requires an evade option for light units, and so that's built in. It's an interesting approach in so much that it's possible for light cavalry, for example, well, any light troops, but it is most notable in cavalry combats. You can push your light cavalry straight in front of heavy cavalry, discharge your missiles, or fire your arquebuses or muskets or crossbows or whatever it is. And in the opponent's next turn, when they're the opposing, let's say, heavy cavalry that have 2 actions, advance against your light cavalry can roll to try to evade, which, if they're steady, is a pretty good chance that they'll make the test. And if they do, they slow the enemy heavy cavalry to just 1 action, 1 box of movement. So light cavalry aren't just necessarily just swept away. Even though they can't melee heavy cavalry, they can certainly cause opposing heavy cavalry to slow their tempo. And that's a really important tactical consideration. In the rules, before I get into the combat rules, so shooting and melee, I do have a section which deals with, well, what happens to units when they take hits? And so it's sort of an introduction. Most of these rules are actually embedded in the combat sections, but I wanted a place where they were just sort of concentrated to kind of prepare you for the combat sections. And as you can see, it's just 2 pages, and then you get right into the combat sections, first shooting. An important part of the game is that every unit is granted what's referred to as a combat and control value. It's a single number, and that number is critically important in the game in so much that it tells you how many dice you're going to throw in shooting combat, how many dice you're going to throw in melee, and these numbers are modified circumstantially with, again, some modifiers, but the modifiers don't affect what you need to roll. They simply affect the number of dice you throw. Something that's true between shooting and melee is that 4 to 6 is good using D6s. Those are hits. That never changes. Just the number of dice you throw changes. So for example, a pike block, sorry, we're dealing with shooting here, but let's say a heavy unit of musketeers with a combat and control value of 4, its base number of dice would be 4. And then modifiers would affect that number. If the musketeers remain stationary, they'll roll 5 dice. If a target is at a longer range, they'll go back down to 4 dice. And then they throw their dice looking for 4 to 6s to score hits. Very, very straight up. There are some special rules for horse archers, which of course still persist into this period. There's also even rules that I held on from Caesar concerning massed archery, because of course, again, into our period, certain armies still persisted with massed archery, massed bowmen. Melee. There's some specific rules, of course, in terms of dealing with charges. There's one particular kind of charge called a diagonal charge, which really represents a kind of disorganized closing into the into an opponent's box. But that's really just a very particular permutation that derives from the fact that we're using a gridded playing surface. A lot of gridded games actually allow units a free turning move, and I didn't like that. That ran contrary to my basic movement rules. So I developed a patch, if you will, for this peculiar situation where 2 units are sort of corner to corner to each other and needed to close without causing one or the other grief or disadvantage. Anyway, you'll read that in the rules. I won't go on about that. But as I say, it is dealt with in some detail. Melee, as I said, it uses basically the same mechanic. You have your base combat and control value, number of dice, and then modifiers that add or subtract dice, and then you're looking for 4 to 6s. A pike block, for example, it will have a base value, if they're sort of average troops, of 4 d6s. But if that pike block, for example, is fighting just a spear unit, let's say, pike blocks are close order pike units, that is their order density. The spearmen will more than likely just be massed order. The pikes will get a plus, so 5 dice. In addition, pike blocks, because of their inherent integration of soldiers like halberdiers and swordsmen, are granted what the rules refer to as an aggression modifier, which gives them an advantage throughout a melee, as long as the pike block is formed, not unformed. And these are bonus dice, so a French pike block would get an extra die, so that would be now up to 6 dice when fighting that spear unit. Swiss and Landsknecht get 2 extra dice, so that's 4, 5, 6, 7 dice they're throwing. And if Swiss are fighting Landsknecht, the so-called bad war, they each get a bonus of 3 dice. So, it can be really quite nasty. You're throwing a lot of dice. There's an element of bucket of dice, but it's not a big bucket. You would never roll an enormous number of dice in this game, maybe compared to sort of other games. But it is a number of dice, and I actually like throwing a good handful of dice because I think that brings out averages better than, for example, just let's say a single die throw to get results. There, the swings of luck are more profound. Shock, of course, has a role to play in melee. Most of the things as you'd expect. Flank attacks are very, very simple. I won't go into the details. They don't really complicate the game much at all. But here's where you're probably going to roll a few more dice, because an effective flank charge will double the number of dice that you're throwing against the flanked unit. It can be very, very nasty indeed. So once we've gotten through those combat sections, and of course we need to go back to the consequences of combat, and here again I speak to things like control tests, and of course the namesake of the rule, as I say, control tests and catastrophe tests. One of the most important things in the game is that a unit never breaks simply because an accrued number of hits. It breaks because it's arrived at this point of exhaustion, if you will, and then rolls a catastrophe test. Better quality units might stand actually a very good chance of continuing the fight. So a combat and control value of 5, so knights or some kind of elite unit, they're referred to as tough in the game because they are. It's quite possible that they will arrive at their threshold of catastrophe, of a certain number of hits, and but continue to fight. And if they keep winning in melee, they don't roll at all. So you can have these units that are teetering on the edge of oblivion, but if they're good units, they actually stand a chance of staying in the fight. And while on average they can only do that for a while, at some point, obviously, dice luck will betray them. But it is possible, in theory, for a unit to sort of fight through the game, and especially if they keep winning melee, and not break. There are optional rules if you don't like that, whereby, of course, every time they're forced to take a test, it becomes ever harder and harder. The basic game just has 1 penalty, but there is an optional rule for accrued penalties if that's what you want to use. Okay, this is all that's basic stuff, and I don't want to sort of speak at much more. You can see that there's obviously the standard sort of terrain rules, what you'd expect. There's rules for camps, there's rules for ambush positions, there's a little bit about weather, although I find that that's better handled by scenarios. Then we get to, I think, probably one of the most important parts of the book, and this is the special units and tactics section. In Control the Catastrophe Seizure, this was called Special Rules for Special Units. I changed the name of this, but it's the same section effectively in terms of the sort of the what it represents. This is where we get the rules for things like pike blocks and some rules specific to the Swiss, at least early in the period. I deal specifically also with Spanish colonellas and tercio squadrons. They have special rules, and they are starting, these Spanish units are starting to bridge the narrative into pike and shot units. Again, more special rules for pike and shot. None of these special rules are particularly challenging, and they leverage the basic game rules. So there's not much necessarily new to learn, but they add a lot of character to your army, and so that a Spanish army operates quite differently than, let's say, a Swiss army or a Dutch force, as you'd expect. So, you know, I really hope that that sort of comes through in what I'm talking about. We have, as I say, the pike and shot units that can be represented in different ways. I should stress that how you represent units, as I mentioned before, is entirely up to you. You will have an army list with the stats and numbers attached to your units. And while I think it's useful to show that a pike block is deeper than other units, that cavalry are almost always shallow units and therefore a little more brittle in combat, more fluid, you know, the melees decide more quickly. But if you like 2 ranks of cavalry, you should have 2 ranks of cavalry models. Doesn't matter. If you like your pike blocks to actually be sort of a bit shallower or much bigger or wider, whatever you want, as long as you can accommodate that in the box, how you represent them is up to you. As I say, though, that the different unit types should somehow be indicated, though, by how you represent them. I think that just makes sense, and I don't think it matters what the rule set is. I think that, you know, that's a kind of a given. We have rules for the Swedish doctrine as well, of course, the Swedish brigade. Pike and shot hedgehog. We have, of course, rules for salvo. We have rules for caracoling. Now, pistol-armed cavalry is handled, I think, a little differently. While there's the standard sort of trotters and gallopers that you've seen in other games, something that's a little unique is that gallopers are given a shock bonus in melee, but never shoot at range unless they fail to close. Again, not to go into detail, this is supposed to be just a leaf through, but pistol-armed cavalry historically had a bit of a reputation for, especially if they were poorer quality pistol-armed cavalry, regardless of doctrine that they used. You know, sometimes these cavalrymen would trot up and just discharge their pistols, sometimes even just in the air, and say, hey, my duty's done. Shock doctrine cavalry, gallopers, have a much better chance of closing into melee than trotters who would favor, of course, discharging their pistols. So, you know, the game represents these, you know, different doctrines, but there isn't this fuss of closing with the enemy, rolling for pistol shots, then resolving the melee. That's dealt with based upon whether you actually close or not. And if you close into melee, then it's just a melee. You don't worry about the pistols. Those are assumed to be used in the melee anyway. Obviously some rules for, you know, units like Stratiots and Jeannettes and Croats, rules for commanded musketeers and heavy cavalry units that are supported by light foot. Of course, artillery gets some attention, specifically as you'd expect. These rules, by the way, were by and large presented already in Caesar because of the late medieval use of cannons, but here there are some distinctions, but the base mechanics are the same. So, organ guns, of course, dismounting cavalry. I actually left elephants in the rule book because, just like massed archery, you know, elephants continued to be used by some armies, especially, of course, Asian armies. The army lists, which are free download, at the moment do not include sort of Central and East Asian armies. It does include the Ottomans. But this is just simply not an area of expertise, and I'm hoping that the community kind of chimes in and generates some lists. The lists are an organic document. They'll always be for free, and they will always be updated as more lists are developed and old lists are tweaked with more research. But, you know, for the moment, there are no Central and East Asian lists. Section on optional rules, this is where that alternative turn sequence is presented, and a few other sort of options that, you know, change the game that I felt shouldn't be part of the core rules because, you know, it came down to sort of player preference. I kept those, you know, basic rules just that basic. I know with Caesar, I received some feedback to say, well, it'd be kind of fun to have what a friend of mine calls exploding dice. So if you roll a 6, instead of just 1 hit, it would be 2 hits. And of course, this can potentially speed play, but it also has the effect of making more common a concept known as a rupture test, when the difference in melee hits is significant and you can potentially break an opponent regardless of the number of hits that they've already accrued. Using the exploding dice rule, ruptures become potentially much more common, and so it's a choice that you have that you can make. Finally, there's some sample lists for the Italian Wars and an attached couple of scenarios for the Italian Wars, the Battle of Ravenna and Navarra, and also sample lists for the English Civil War, just a couple of them. There's more in the free download, and again, an example scenario of the Battle of Edge Hill. So there it is. Sorry, I went a little long. It's half an hour. I was hoping for 20 minutes, but there is Control the Catastrophe, Maximilian. Thanks for watching and listening. I hope you give it a try. It's available on Wargame Vault, and you can get a little bit of information and downloads on the Decisive Wargame Design website. The rules for the PDF retail at $15, and the paperback book, softcover book, is $32, I think. So I hope you've enjoyed the video. Take care, happy gaming, and if you have any questions, chime in on the Facebook group for Control the Catastrophe Caesar, and also a separate group for Control the Catastrophe Maximilian. All right, take care.